What drove 50,000 Romans to gather in a single place, cheering as blood soaked into sand beneath their feet? The answer lies in the darkest corners of ancient Rome, where entertainment meant death and spectacle meant suffering on an industrial scale. The Colosseum stands today as a monument to architectural genius, but its true legacy is written in the screams of the condemned and the roar of starving beasts. Between its opening in 80 AD and the final games centuries later, this single arena consumed more human and animal lives than entire wars. Yet Rome's bloodlust extended far beyond one amphitheater. Across the empire, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Germania, Roman arenas transformed killing into the empire's most profitable entertainment industry. These were not random acts of violence or chaotic massacres. Every death was choreographed, every scream calculated, every drop of blood designed to serve the political machinery of the world's most powerful empire. The Romans didn't just conquer through military might. They maintained control through systematic terror disguised as public celebration. But how did a civilization that gave us law, literature, and engineering create such elaborate theaters of cruelty? The origins trace back to something seemingly innocent: funeral rites during the Punic Wars of the 3rd century BC. What began as religious ceremonies to honor the dead by spilling blood gradually transformed into political theater. Roman officials discovered that crowds gathered for blood and crowds meant power. The early contests were small affairs, a few condemned prisoners fighting to the death at a nobleman's funeral. But as Rome's territorial ambitions grew, so did the scale of its spectacles. Politicians competed to stage increasingly elaborate games, understanding that the mob's loyalty could be bought with bread and circuses. The Latin phrase panem circense became the unofficial motto of Roman governance. Keep the masses fed and entertained, and they won't question your authority. By the 1st century AD, what started as funeral rites had evolved into a massive state-sponsored industry of death. The games served multiple purposes simultaneously. They demonstrated imperial power by showcasing Rome's ability to capture exotic beasts from the far reaches of the known world. They provided a safety valve for social tensions by giving the poor a spectacular distraction from their misery. Most importantly, they reinforced Rome's rigid social hierarchy by literally placing life and death at the emperor's discretion. The construction of the Colosseum under Emperor Vespasian represented the culmination of this evolution. Officially known as the Amphitheatrum Flavium, this engineering marvel could accommodate 50,000 spectators in a carefully arranged social pyramid. The emperor and patrician nobility sat closest to the action, while slaves and the urban poor were relegated to the upper tiers. Every seat was positioned to provide an unobstructed view of the killing floor below. But the Colosseum's true innovation lay beneath the arena floor, in a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical lifts that ancient Romans called the hypogeum. This subterranean maze served as the backstage area for Rome's theater of death. Wild animals were housed in cages that could be lifted directly onto the arena floor through trapdoors. Condemned prisoners waited in holding cells, listening to the roar of crowds above as they prepared for their final moments. Gladiators received last-minute weapons and armor before stepping into the sunlight to face their destiny. The arena floor itself was covered in sand. Arena in Latin, which gives us the English word arena. This wasn't decorative. The sand served the practical purpose of absorbing the enormous quantities of blood spilled daily during the games. Between events, work crews would rake fresh sand over the stains and remove body parts that might distract from the next spectacle. The daily schedule of horror followed a precise rhythm designed to maintain audience engagement from dawn to dusk. Morning brought the venations, elaborate animal hunts that showcased Rome's dominance over nature itself. Professional hunters called venatores faced exotic predators in choreographed battles that combined genuine danger with theatrical spectacle. Lions from Africa, tigers from Asia, bears from the northern forests, and elephants from distant lands were paraded before the crowds before meeting their choreographed deaths. These morning hunts served multiple propaganda purposes. They demonstrated Rome's global reach by displaying creatures that most citizens would never otherwise see. They reinforced the empire's narrative of civilization conquering barbarism, with Roman hunters representing order and control, while wild beasts embodied the chaos that existed beyond imperial borders. Most importantly, they warmed up the audience for the day's main attractions. The midday interval brought perhaps the most disturbing element of Roman entertainment, the ludi meridiani, public executions disguised as theatrical performances. Condemned criminals were forced to reenact scenes from classical mythology in which they would inevitably die. A prisoner might be cast as Orpheus, torn apart by wild animals, or as Icarus, burned alive by artificial flames. The Romans transformed judicial punishment into elaborate theater, stripping away any remaining dignity from the condemned while providing religious justification for mass murder. These executions weren't random violence. They followed legal procedures established by Roman courts. The practice known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was reserved for the empire's most despised enemies: runaway slaves, political prisoners, and Christians who refused to acknowledge the divinity of Roman emperors. The condemned were brought into the arena completely naked and defenseless, making their deaths as humiliating and terrifying as possible. The psychological torture began long before the physical violence. Prisoners knew exactly what awaited them, and many attempted suicide rather than face the prolonged agony of being torn apart by wild animals. Historical accounts describe German prisoners choking themselves to death by eating sponges, groups of condemned men strangling each other in their cells the night before their executions, and desperate individuals impaling themselves on spikes rather than provide entertainment for Roman crowds. The Romans imported exotic predators specifically for these executions, creating an international trade network centered entirely around death. Lions, leopards, tigers, bears, crocodiles, and other dangerous animals were captured across the empire and transported to Rome at enormous expense. This wasn't just cruelty, it was systematic environmental destruction disguised as entertainment. The scale of animal slaughter in Roman arenas represents one of history's greatest ecological catastrophes. During the Colosseum's inaugural 100-day celebration, approximately 9,000 animals were killed according to the historian Cassius Dio. This was just the opening ceremony. Over the following centuries, tens of thousands more creatures died for momentary entertainment. Entire species disappeared from their native habitats, not through natural causes or gradual hunting pressure, but through the systematic capture and transport of every available specimen to feed Rome's insatiable appetite for spectacle. The afternoon climax featured gladiatorial combat, where trained warriors fought in elaborate duels that combined genuine skill with the constant threat of death. But these fighters weren't random volunteers. They were products of a sophisticated training system that operated as a combination of prison, school, and business enterprise. The gladiatorial schools, called ludi, represented some of Rome's most profitable investments. Most gladiators were prisoners of war, slaves purchased specifically for arena combat, or criminals condemned to serve in the schools as punishment. Upon entering these institutions, they signed contracts stipulating their fighting style, the number of annual appearances required, and effectively surrendering ownership of their bodies to their masters. Training within these schools was methodical and merciless. Under the supervision of expert instructors, gladiators learned to kill efficiently while providing maximum entertainment value. Different fighting styles were kept rigidly separated to prevent conflicts between warriors who would eventually face each other in mortal combat. The heavily armored secutores practiced with sword and shield, while the lightly armed retiari mastered their nets and tridents. Mounted equites perfected horseback combat techniques, and specialized fighters learned to wield exotic weapons from across the empire. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Archaeological evidence suggests that gladiators could be executed simply for disobedience or poor performance during training. These men lived under constant threat, knowing that any mistake might result in immediate death. Yet paradoxically, successful gladiators could achieve a form of celebrity status among the Roman masses, their names chanted by crowds who simultaneously viewed them as subhuman property. Despite their fame, Gladiators occupied the absolute bottom of Roman society. They were legally classified as infames, people without honor or rights. They could be bought, sold, tortured, or killed at their owner's discretion. For every legendary fighter who won freedom through arena victories, thousands died anonymously on the blood-soaked sand, their bodies dragged away through the Porta Libitinaria, the gate of death that no gladiator wished to take. But perhaps no figure better embodies the complete moral collapse of Roman arena culture than Emperor Commodus, who ruled from 177 to 192 AD. This man didn't merely watch the carnage from his imperial box. He became its most enthusiastic participant, convinced he was the reincarnation of Hercules walking among mortals. Commodus descended into the arena personally, slaughtering exotic animals with disturbing efficiency. According to the historian Cassius Dio, he once killed 100 lions in a single day. His favorite trick involved decapitating running ostriches with specially designed darts, then carrying the bleeding heads to the senator's seating area while making throat-cutting gestures to suggest they would be next. The message was unmistakable. Even Rome's most powerful citizens existed at the emperor's mercy. The emperor's participation in gladiatorial combat scandalized the Roman elite, who viewed such behavior as beneath imperial dignity. Fighting in the arena was the occupation of slaves and criminals, yet here was the ruler of the known world reducing himself to their level. But Commodus felt no shame. He charged the state treasury 1 million sesterces for each of his arena appearances, effectively bankrupting the empire to fund his personal bloodlust. His cruelty extended beyond animal slaughter to systematic torture of society's most vulnerable members. Commodus forced disabled individuals to fight each other in grotesque parodies of gladiatorial combat, or personally clubbed them to death while pretending to reenact mythological scenes. He killed elephants, giraffes, and other exotic creatures not for any practical purpose, but simply because their deaths provided him with momentary pleasure. The Romans transformed these killings into elaborate theatrical productions, complete with costumes, scripts, and ceremonial procedures designed to strip away any remaining humanity from the victims. When gladiators fell in combat, 2 attendants dressed as mythological figures would enter the arena to determine whether death had truly occurred. One wore the costume of Charon, ferryman of the underworld, while the other represented Mercury, messenger of the gods. Mercury carried a red-hot metal rod to test for signs of life in the fallen warrior. Any movement or response meant the gladiator still lived, at which point Charon would finish the job with his massive ceremonial mace. Only when both attendants confirmed death could the body be dragged through the Porta Libitinaria to the disposal areas outside the amphitheater. Even in death, Romans denied their victims dignity through these theatrical rituals. The execution of Christians provided particularly elaborate opportunities for theatrical cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe how condemned believers were forced to dress as priests and priestesses of Roman gods before being presented to the crowds. Men wore the robes of Saturn while women donned the garments of Ceres, transforming their martyrdom into a religious spectacle that mocked their faith while entertaining the masses. These victims were chained to poles or elevated platforms where wild animals could reach them easily. Those who survived the initial attacks were either exposed to fresh beasts or publicly executed by gladiators. The Romans created complex mythological narratives around these killings, forcing prisoners to participate in stories where their deaths served as the predetermined climax. But the arena system represented far more than random cruelty. It was a massive economic enterprise that consumed enormous imperial resources while serving crucial political functions. By the height of the empire, 135 days each year were devoted to public games. This meant more than 1/3 of the Roman calendar was dedicated to state-sponsored violence and spectacle. The games created an entire economy centered around death and entertainment. Animal traders established networks spanning continents to capture exotic creatures for arena slaughter. Gladiator trainers operated schools across the empire, breeding and conditioning human beings for combat. Weapon makers specialized in arena equipment, crafting swords, nets, tridents, and armor designed specifically for spectacular killing. Arena maintenance required armies of workers to clean blood from the sand, repair damaged equipment, and dispose of the endless stream of corpses. Food vendors sold refreshments to bloodthirsty crowds. Betting operations took wagers on combat outcomes. Souvenir merchants hawked trinkets commemorating famous gladiators or memorable deaths. An entire civilization organized itself around the systematic production of suffering for entertainment. The resources devoted to this industry were staggering. Transporting thousands of wild animals across vast distances required enormous logistical networks. Housing and feeding gladiators, maintaining amphitheaters, and staging elaborate spectacles consumed wealth that could have built cities, funded armies, or improved the lives of ordinary citizens. Instead, Rome chose to invest its prosperity in increasingly sophisticated methods of turning death into theater. The political logic was ruthlessly simple. Spectacle prevented revolution. Emperors understood that hungry, angry crowds posed existential threats to imperial power. But crowds distracted by magnificent displays of violence could be controlled, manipulated, and pacified. The arena served as both safety valve and propaganda tool, channeling popular frustrations into acceptable outlets while demonstrating the absolute power of Roman authority. Citizens learned their place in the imperial hierarchy by watching others die at the emperor's command. The message was unmistakable: resist the state and face the beasts. Challenge authority and join the condemned in their final performance. Submit to Roman rule and enjoy the spectacle from the safety of the stands. This systematic transformation of death into entertainment reveals something profound about the nature of imperial power and social control. The Romans didn't maintain their empire solely through military conquest. They sustained it through psychological domination, creating a culture where citizens actively participated in and celebrated the suffering of their fellow human beings. The arena's grip on Roman society extended beyond mere entertainment. It fundamentally rewired the moral fabric of an entire civilization. Citizens who might show compassion to a neighbor's suffering would cheer wildly as strangers were torn apart by wild beasts. Mothers brought their children to witness executions, teaching the next generation that human life held value only when it served imperial purposes. The transformation was so complete that mercy became a foreign concept, replaced by an insatiable hunger for increasingly elaborate forms of death. This psychological conditioning served the empire's broader goals with terrifying efficiency. Roman soldiers who had witnessed thousands of deaths in the arena felt no hesitation when ordered to crucify rebels or massacre entire villages. Governors who had cheered gladiatorial combat showed no mercy when sentencing criminals to damnatio et bestias. The arena didn't just reflect Roman brutality, it manufactured it, creating a society where violence became the primary language of power. The architectural design of amphitheaters reinforced these social dynamics through calculated manipulation of crowd behavior. Seating arrangements weren't random. They were psychological tools designed to maximize the impact of spectacle. The emperor's elevated position allowed him to survey both the killing floor and his subjects simultaneously, reinforcing his role as arbiter of life and death. Patricians sat close enough to see blood splatter and hear dying screams, while the poor craned their necks from distant upper tiers, desperate for glimpses of the carnage they couldn't afford to witness up close. Sound engineering played a crucial role in this manipulation. The curved walls of amphitheaters amplified screams and roars, ensuring that every death cry reached the furthest seats. The acoustics were so precisely calculated that emperors could whisper commands that would be heard throughout the arena, their words carrying the weight of divine authority. When 50,000 voices roared approval for a gladiator's death, the sound created a physical force that participants described as overwhelming, a collective release of bloodlust that bound the crowd into a single murderous entity. The timing of arena events followed patterns designed to build psychological tension throughout the day. Morning animal hunts served as warm-up acts, desensitizing audiences to violence while building anticipation for human suffering. The midday executions provided a brief respite from competitive combat, allowing crowds to witness helpless victims torn apart without the uncertainty of gladiatorial duels. By afternoon, when trained fighters entered the arena, spectators were primed for maximum emotional investment in death. Weather conditions were carefully monitored and exploited to enhance the psychological impact of games. Blazing summer heat intensified the smell of blood and made dying more agonizing for victims while creating discomfort that crowds could only relieve through emotional release. Winter games took advantage of shorter daylight hours, concentrating violence into compressed time frames that heightened intensity. Rain transformed sand into bloody mud, creating visual spectacles that lingered in memory long after the games ended. The selection of victims followed calculated patterns designed to maximize social control while providing varied entertainment. Political prisoners died first, their executions serving as warnings to anyone who might challenge imperial authority. Religious dissidents followed, their martyrdom transformed into theater that mocked their beliefs while demonstrating the futility of resistance. Common criminals came next, their deaths reinforcing social hierarchies by showing what happened to those who violated Roman law. Foreign captives provided opportunities for patriotic spectacle, their deaths symbolically reenacting Rome's military victories for audiences who would never witness actual battles. Barbarian warriors were forced to fight in their native styles, allowing Romans to feel superior as civilized spectators watching primitive savages destroy each other. Women prisoners faced special humiliations designed to reinforce gender roles while providing titillation for male audiences hungry for degradation disguised as entertainment. The training methods used in gladiatorial schools revealed the systematic nature of Roman cruelty. Instructors didn't simply teach fighting techniques. They conditioned human beings to kill efficiently while maximizing audience entertainment. Gladiators learned to wound opponents in ways that prolonged dying, to fall dramatically when struck, and to appeal for mercy in gestures that would inflame crowd bloodlust. Every movement was choreographed to serve spectacle rather than survival. Dietary controls formed part of this conditioning process. Gladiators received carefully measured nutrition designed to build muscle mass while maintaining psychological vulnerability. Too much food might make them confident. Too little would reduce their fighting ability. The perfect balance created warriors who were physically capable but emotionally desperate, fighting with the intensity of men who knew their lives hung on audience approval. Sleep deprivation was weaponized as another tool of control. Gladiators were kept awake before major contests, their exhaustion making them more likely to make fatal mistakes that would please crowds. The combination of physical fatigue and psychological stress created fighters who performed with manic intensity, their desperation translating into spectacular displays of violence that satisfied Roman appetites for suffering. Medical attention for gladiators followed similar calculated patterns. Wounds were treated only when they enhanced future entertainment value. Injuries that might create interesting scars were allowed to heal naturally, while damage that could reduce fighting ability received expert care. Gladiator physicians became specialists in keeping human beings alive just long enough to die entertainingly in front of paying audiences. The betting systems that surrounded gladiatorial combat created additional layers of cruelty masked as entertainment. Wealthy Romans wagered enormous sums on fight outcomes, their financial investments intensifying their emotional engagement with death. Slaves were sometimes forced to bet their freedom on combat results, creating situations where spectators had direct stakes in whether particular gladiators lived or died. These betting networks extended beyond simple win-loss predictions to include elaborate propositions about how deaths would occur. Gamblers could wager on whether a gladiator would beg for mercy, how many wounds he would suffer before falling, or whether wild animals would consume their victims completely. The possibilities were endless, and each new betting option created demand for increasingly specific forms of suffering. Professional bookmakers established themselves as experts in predicting gladiatorial outcomes, studying fighters' techniques, physical conditions, and psychological states to offer odds that would maximize profits. These individuals became celebrities in their own right, their predictions sought after by Romans desperate to gain advantages in the arena's gambling culture. The economic ripple effects of this betting system spread throughout Roman society. Fortunes were won and lost based on gladiatorial performances, creating boom-bust cycles that affected everything from real estate prices to food costs. Successful bettors gained social status that allowed them to sponsor their own games, while losers might find themselves condemned to the arena as gladiators themselves, their gambling debts transformed into death sentences. Imperial involvement in arena betting created additional layers of corruption and manipulation. Emperors who wagered on specific outcomes could influence results through threats or promises made to gladiators before combat. Fixed fights became common, their predetermined results known only to select insiders who profited from advanced knowledge, while ordinary citizens lost money on rigged contests. The religious dimensions of arena spectacles provided final layers of justification for systematic cruelty. Roman priests declared that gladiatorial blood possessed sacred properties, claiming that spilled gore could appease angry gods and ensure imperial prosperity. These religious pronouncements transformed mass murder into acts of devotion, allowing citizens to feel virtuous while celebrating human suffering. Temples were constructed adjacent to major amphitheaters, their altars receiving offerings of gladiator blood collected from arena sand. Priests performed elaborate ceremonies before major games, blessing the weapons that would soon kill condemned prisoners and asking divine favor for the entertainment to follow. The integration of religion and spectacle created powerful psychological justifications that allowed Romans to participate in systematic cruelty while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. The international scope of Rome's arena system created networks of suffering that spanned continents. Provincial amphitheaters in distant territories replicated the capital's spectacles on smaller scales, spreading Roman methods of social control throughout the empire. Local populations were forced to participate in games that violated their cultural values, breaking down traditional moral systems and replacing them with imperial brutality. The logistics required to maintain this global network of death were staggering in their complexity. Ships carrying caged animals crossed the Mediterranean regularly, their holds filled with creatures destined for arena slaughter. Overland caravans transported gladiators between training schools and performance venues, creating mobile populations of condemned fighters who existed solely to die for entertainment. Communication networks kept distant amphitheaters informed about successful spectacle innovations developed in Rome, ensuring that new methods of cruelty spread rapidly throughout the empire. Provincial governors competed to stage games that would impress imperial observers, creating escalating cycles of violence as each territory tried to outdo its neighbors in elaborate displays of suffering. The cultural impact of this system extended far beyond the arena walls, fundamentally altering how Romans understood concepts like justice, mercy, and human dignity. Children raised in this environment learned that strength meant the ability to inflict suffering, while weakness deserved punishment through death. The arena became the empire's primary educational institution, teaching moral lessons through spectacular displays of violence. Art and literature reflected these values with disturbing consistency. Mosaics depicting arena scenes decorated wealthy Roman homes, transforming private spaces into shrines celebrating public murder. Poets composed verses glorifying gladiatorial combat, while painters captured the precise moments when life departed from dying eyes. The empire's cultural output became a catalog of creative methods for depicting human suffering as entertainment. Educational curricula incorporated arena attendance as essential training for future citizens. Young Romans were expected to demonstrate proper appreciation for spectacle by cheering at appropriate moments and showing disgust only at displays of cowardice rather than cruelty. Teachers used gladiatorial metaphors to explain everything from military strategy to proper social behavior, embedding violence so deeply into intellectual frameworks that alternatives became literally unthinkable. The medical profession adapted to serve arena requirements by developing specialized knowledge about prolonging death for maximum entertainment value. Physicians studied wound patterns that would create spectacular bleeding without immediately fatal damage. They perfected techniques for reviving unconscious gladiators so fights could continue past normal endpoints. These doctors became experts in human suffering, their skills devoted entirely to enhancing rather than alleviating pain. Legal systems evolved to feed the arena's endless hunger for condemned bodies. New crimes were invented specifically to provide steady streams of prisoners suitable for execution by wild animal. Punishments that once might have involved fines or exile were redefined as capital offenses requiring spectacular public death. Justice became subordinate to entertainment as courts functioned primarily as casting agencies for arena spectacles. The Roman arena system finally collapsed not through moral awakening but through economic exhaustion and imperial decay. By the 6th century AD, the empire could no longer afford the massive resources required to maintain its networks of death. The last recorded gladiatorial games occurred in 435 AD, ending nearly 7 centuries of systematic brutality disguised as entertainment. Today, tourists walk through the Colosseum's ruins, marveling at its architectural ingenuity while remaining largely blind to the psychological machinery of terror it once housed. The same human impulses that filled those blood-stained seats still pulse beneath the surface of modern civilization, waiting for the right conditions to emerge once again. What separates us from those cheering Roman crowds? The answer may be less comforting than we imagine.